Now, we just got through with Thanksgiving, and I have to tell you this story about my mother-in-law. For years, after my wife and I got married, we would spend our Thanksgivings with my in-laws. And my mother-in-law was of the generation that, she felt like all meat had issues. It had to be cooked to death, those types of things to kill any of the bugs. But the other thing that she liked to do was she liked the biggest turkey that she could possibly find. Okay? And so there were really two things that went on every Thanksgiving. One was the great turkey cooking war, as I called it. And as I said, she would cook the turkeys until it was so dry that I felt like I was eating sawdust without putting giblet gravy or something on it. And so I would walk through her kitchen and turn the temperature down on the oven, and she would walk through and see that and turn it back up, and we would just keep that little dance going there, But I do remember this one time, she went to the grocery store to buy a turkey, and she always wanted one that weighed well over 20 pounds. And so she went to the bin where they have all the turkeys right before Thanksgiving, and the way that she would judge the weight, she didn't trust the weight on the package. So she had the feel of the turkey. She had to heft it, okay, to determine whether it was heavy enough for her or not. And so she would pick one up and sort of feel the weight and set it aside, and then she would reach down in the bin, grab another one, pick it up, set it aside, and she kept doing that. And there was this stock boy standing off to the side watching her this whole time. And she got down to the very last turkey in the bin and picked it up, sort of felt the weight of it and set it aside. And she turned and looked at the stock boy and said, "Son, did these turkeys get any bigger?" And he said, "No, ma'am, they're dead." So I do want to give you here's some resource information. A lot of our presentations are posted on these websites, or at least the first two. And on the Pastor Project website, we also have a lot of webinars that are recorded that you can access that deal with adaptive grazing, with cover crop livestock integration. And we have numerous other resource tools listed there as well. We have similar resources on the Joyce Farms, our Joyce Farms website. And I've been writing routinely for Graze magazine since 2013, and I'll have at least 36 archived articles on grazeonline.com if you want to access any of those. So please feel free to do so. And just a little bit about who we are, what we do. I was born and raised in South Carolina on our family's farm, been there since 1840. So I basically represent the sixth generation in our family in that particular operation. And it was a very diverse operation when I was growing up. I often tell people that, it was sort of like the old Barbara Mandrell song, "I was country when country wasn't cool." How many people are old enough to remember Barbara Mandrell? Yeah, afraid so. I hear you. But, that's sort of the way I feel, because when I was growing up, we were very diversified. We had sheep and we had pastured pigs, and we didn't know they were pastured. That's just the way we did it. We had pastured poultry, but we called them barnyard birds. We had a diversity of crops that we grew and produce and those types of things. And we had a general store, and we sold a lot of our product through the general store, so that was direct marketing, right? But we didn't know we were doing any of those things. But that was the way we did it at that point in time. And then I went away to school, got into academia, spent 15 years as a researcher and professor at a couple of different universities, my last stint at Mississippi State. And at the end of 15 years, I finally realized that we were experiencing a lot of problems and issues that it really appeared that what we were doing in terms of our research at the universities was actually making those problems worse. All we were doing was putting a Band-Aid on issues rather than addressing the root cause. And so I made the decision, and I was a tenured professor, all of that, so I could have stayed there, no problem. But I made the decision after 15 years to leave because I wanted to do far more than I felt like what we were able to do in that type of situation. And Jonathan, much like you, with Blue Dasher Farm and all of that, I had a lot of the same thought processes in making that decision. So today we do a number of things. We have cow-calf operations. We do a lot of grass finishing. Okay, we do a lot of consulting and field trials. We consult throughout North America, so the U.S., Canada, Mexico, and down into South America. And we've done this for a number of years now. We also participate in a lot of conferences and workshops. I'm on the board of directors of the Grass-Fed Exchange, and so we do those annual conferences. By the way, our next one is coming up in September of 2017 in Albany, New York. So check us out on grassfedexchange.com and look at our agenda. We've got an absolutely fabulous lineup of speakers and farm tours if you want to take advantage of that. And we, as Keith said, we do a ton of workshops around the country, including the one that we did, there in Nebraska. And we also have a meat and poultry company, so we market specialty pork and poultry and grass-fed beef predominantly to upscale restaurants up and down the East Coast. So these are some of the poultry that we raise. They are red-back Kunus or naked necks. Okay, it's a thin-skinned chicken that makes an outstanding product for fine dining. So that's the birds that we have settled on, and we produce poulet rouge and products like that. We also use the heritage black turkey rather than the standard commodity turkey that you see there in the picture. We also produce very high quality grass-fed beef. We'll average on every load, and a load is 42 fats, we'll average about 85% choice and up, and out of every load, about 10 to 12 of those will be USDA prime. So you can achieve very high quality beef, 100% grass-fed, and as you can see, here's some of the pictures of the beef that we produce. So that'll rival any grain-fed beef, folks, anywhere. Anyway, at a workshop I was doing up in Wisconsin a few weeks ago, I ran across this accident scene that you see here on the screen that had an accident in a smart car, and when I got there, an ambulance was carting away the couple that was in the smart car to the emergency room, but the squirrel that they hit refused treatment and left the scene of the accident. So. Okay, so we do have a problem today, folks, that we're facing in agriculture, and here's part of what we're noticing. In Keith's opening presentation, he showed very similar slides, but this is a slide of a massive dust storm on the border of western Kansas, eastern Colorado in January. Now, we shouldn't be seeing this any time of the year, but much less in the dead of winter. And then that is that same dust storm when viewed from ground level. Now, if we'll take a look at this picture, you can see that we're looking at a 2014 dust storm in the upper left in Colorado, and it is eerily similar to a dust storm in the middle of the Dust Bowl in 1930s. We're seeing more and more incidents of these types of things occurring. And it struck me the other day, in Keith, in your history that you gave of the settlement of the Great Plains, it took us less than 60 years to go from invading the Great Plains to creating the Great American Dust Bowl. Less than 60 years. Now, when you look at the timeline, we had 20 plus years of heavy conservation efforts right after this, but now we seem to have forgotten those very lessons that we learned. And so in yet another 60 years, we're right back at that same point. So we are facing some very serious challenges that we're going to have to address. This is another one. I'm working with a number of foundations, including the Windrock Foundation and Walton Family and several others, addressing the hypoxia problem, or the dead zone in the Gulf that we experience every year. And since I reside in Mississippi, you know, for the economies of Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas, the coastal economies, this has a multi-billion-dollar a year impact on those economies due to harm to our estuaries, our fisheries, and to our tourism industries. So this is a real problem, and this is caused by runoff through the upper Mississippi River drainage basin. This is another issue that we're facing. We're seeing ever-increasing acres of grassland being converted into row crop ground to the tune of more, in the figure that I have up here now is actually outdated. We now have more than 10 million acres over the last several years in the Midwest alone that has been converted from former grassland into row crop ground. Now, one of the major issues with that is that a vast majority of that 10 plus million acres is absolutely not suited for row crop production. And we have enormous erosion problems because of it. So we're experiencing more and more of those types of problems. Now, we also have a conundrum that we're facing today. These were two articles that appeared just a few weeks ago on the exact same Sunday in two different newspapers. The USA Today article was talking about the proposed Monsanto-Bayer merger, and they were interviewing farmers to get their thoughts on that merger. And one of the first things that the farmers said was, well, we fear further price control and those types of things. But then the second thing they said, but yet we're hopeful that this merger will produce additional GM crops and chemicals that help us increase our yields. However, the exact same day, the Houston Chronicle had an article interviewing farmers from the same state, and the title of that article was "Bumper Yields Plow Farmers Under." So now what is it? Do we want higher yields? Yet when we get higher yields, what happens? This happens. More crop, less cash. Keith, very similar to the wheat, right? That you talked about earlier. So this appeared the very week that I was in Nebraska speaking at that 8 workshop tour in the Omaha World Herald, talking about farm economics deteriorating, land values falling, loan defaults rising. All of these things occurring. But yet, U.S. farmers once again produced record corn and soybean yields. However, farm income is down 42% since 2013. Now, George Monboy had this comment last year. He said, we're treating soil like dirt, and it's a fatal mistake, as our lives depend on it. War, pestilence, even climate change are trifles by comparison. Destroy the soil and we all starve. That's eerily similar to a comment made a long time ago in 1500 BC by a Jewish philosopher. And he said this, upon this handful of soil our survival depends. Husband it, and it will grow our food, our fuel, our shelter, and surround us with beauty. abuse it, and the soil will collapse and die, taking humanity with it. According to the United Nations, FAO, global soil destruction is so intense that they estimate that we only have another 60 to 100 years left of optimum crop production before we start experiencing severe famine around the world. And yet at the same time, we're talking about significant population growth over the next 30 years. We're going to need almost 15 acres of new cropland annually to feed that population growth. But yet, we're losing twice that, okay, each year through soil degradation. The techniques that were supposed to feed the world are now the same techniques that threaten us with starvation. And this is very interesting. In an analysis of undisturbed sediment in an 11th century French lake, it revealed that the intensification of farming over the last century has increased the rate of erosion 60 times. 60 times. And Russ, we've seen river flow rates over the last several decades increase, up to 400-fold. Up to 400-fold. So we do have issues that we're facing. And this is a timeline of what happens with soil, with poor farming practices. You see what that soil looked like in 1961, and now compare that same field in 2002 after 16 years of continuous corn, soybean crop rotation. Dramatically different. Another paper by researchers in the United Kingdom shows that soil in urban allotments, and that's just small pieces of soil, even rooftop gardens, those types of things, in cities and in towns, actually contain a third more organic carbon and 25% more nitrogen than our typical farmland soils in the U.S. Many of these allotments, these urban allotments, folks, and we ought to take this to heart and feel a little bit ashamed by this. We're talking about people in the cities raising gardens that on the same plots of land are producing 4 to 11 times more food than what we're producing on our giant farms around the countryside. And we're seeing this in the U.S. I have clients that are able to produce between $40,000 and $80,000 an acre revenue on their farms. $40,000 to $80,000 an acre revenue. I was talking to one of them just the other day. His name is Douglas Hayes out in California. Now, folks, that's our potential. That's the types of things that we can do. And yet we're struggling to even break even on many of our farms and ranches. But we have people out there that are clearly showing us a way that we can do things far better. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is that, as Keith related earlier and as Jonathan related, we have hope. Okay? We actually have solutions. And those solutions start with the soil. This is a diagram from Dr. Elaine Ingham, just simply showing the soil food web. And in other words, what it boils down to is that to have vibrant, thriving life above the soil surface, we've got to have vibrant, thriving life beneath the soil surface. If I take a shovel and I dig into your soils on your farms and ranches, I should see evidence of more life beneath your soil surface than what I'm seeing on top of it. And here's something we need to remember, is that 90% of soil function is mediated by microbes in the soil. but yet those microbes are dependent on the plants. So how we manage our plants is critical to the success of those microbes in the soil. So plant growth and health is highly correlated with how much life and what kind of life is in the soil. So bottom line, just as Jonathan stated that bugs matter, insects matter, microbes matter. And more importantly, that microbial community structure matters. This is what an acre of healthy soil should look like. Okay? Now, don't pay attention to the numbers in the middle column. You see for bacteria there, that incredibly large number that's not quite the size of our national debt, but still rather large. You know, rather pay attention to numbers we can relate to over here in the far right-hand column in red. So here's what we should see. If we have an acre of healthy soil, we should see more than a ton of bacteria, more than 1,000 pounds of actinobacteria, more than a ton of fungi, more than 130 pounds of predators in the soil, the favorable protozoa and nematodes, more than 400 pounds of earthworms per acre, and more than 800 pounds of insects per acre. So you add all of that up, and that means that for every acre, if we have truly healthy, vibrant soil, we should have more than 3 tons of life in and just on the surface of that soil. A handful of healthy soil contains more microorganisms than all the people who have ever lived on the face of this earth in the whole course of history. A handful of healthy soil. And George Monbiot, I love this quote from him, but he says, soil is an almost magical substance, a living system that transforms the materials it encounters, making them available to plants. And so we're going to spend some time talking about that. Okay, so what are the role of microbes? Well, one is, if we look at mycorrhizal fungi do a number of very favorable things for us. First of all, they produce a soil glue called glomalin or glomalin. And this soil glue, they use it to attach themselves to the roots of plants in the soil. But yet we get another benefit from it in that these soil glues aggregate soil particles and significantly increase the ability of our soils to absorb and capture oxygen and water, the things that are critical for life. Now, in addition, mycorrhizal fungi, they're very long, thread-like or filamentous organisms, and I'll show you a picture here in a little bit. But when they attach themselves to the roots of the plant, they greatly extend the reach of those plant roots to pick up and absorb nutrients. And mycorrhizal fungi are so good at absorbing nutrients in the soil that they can do this 6 to 10 times better than the plant roots themselves. They're so good at it that they can even extract mineral out of rock and feed that mineral to the plants. So they feed the plants, and the plant roots in return produce root exudates or sugars that feed the mycorrhizal fungi. So it's the world's oldest bartering system, and it works quite well. Our problem is that when we do a lot of cultivation, what happens to the mycorrhizal fungi? We've destroyed it. When we use a lot of glyphosates, what happens to the mycorrhizal fungi? We have destroyed it. Okay? So there's a lot of practices that we put into place that are not very favorable for the mycorrhizal fungi. We should have between 10 and 50,000 different species of microbes within a single gram of soil, and if we do, their nutrient cycling services are worth up to $20 trillion annually, making them the world's most valuable ecosystem. Now, this is what some of our soil bacteria looks like. The actinomycetes or actinobacteria there, How do we know if we've got a lot of that in our soil? What is the immediate thing that we notice if we've got a lot of actinobacteria in our soils? Exactly, you can smell it. A deep, rich, earthy aroma. How many people remember that when you used to till fields? How many people smell that anymore? Your soil almost smells sterile now, doesn't it? You know, we don't have a lot of aroma to it. This is mycorrhizal fungi. Outlined in red is the plant root itself, and all of those fine white thread-like organisms branching out from the plant root are mycorrhizal fungi. If that plant did not have the mycorrhizal fungi associated with it, it could only absorb nutrients that were in direct contact with the roots. That's it. But you can see from the picture that when you have a strong mycorrhizal fungi population in the soil, that you greatly extend the reach of those plant roots. Now, another thing that mycorrhizal fungi do for our plants and for us is that it interconnects plants in the soil, the roots. And when we have diversity and complexity in those plant species, then the mycorrhizal fungi become even more important, because that interconnection allows them to be able to feed different secondary and tertiary compounds that different plants produce to other plants that don't produce those. Okay? And it also helps to increase disease and pest resistance in our plants when we have a thriving mycorrhizal fungi population. Now, another thing that's critical in our soils that we are almost devoid of. So, mycorrhizal fungi, we do hundreds of thousands of soil tests annually across North America and down into Mexico. And there's three things that our tests show us our soils are heavily lacking. One is the mycorrhizal fungi. Second are soil protozoa. And protozoa are the predators of the soil. Just like above the soil, if we want to control the deer population, we've got to have predators and hunters to do that. Beneath the soil, we need predator populations to control the prey in the soil, and the prey in the soil are the bacteria. And without those predators, our soils become highly bacteria-centric. And the protozoa, one of their jobs is to consume the bacteria, and the bacteria, they consume nutrients as they're pushed down through the root zone and trap them within their cellular membranes to hold them. But they're not a time-release capsule. So the way that those nutrients are released from the bacteria is through them being consumed by the protozoa. So without the protozoa, our soils become bacteria-centric, and our bacteria lock up a lot of our nutrients, and they're not available for plant uptake. Nematodes, favorable nematodes, perform a very similar function. Not all nematodes are bad. There's actually, just like not all insects are pest insects, same with nematodes. There's actually far more favorable than there are unfavorable. We just have to keep that balance. Now, all of those things that I just showed you are microscopic, so we can't see them with the naked eye. Yet there are indicator species that we can see that allow us to be able to gauge what we're doing in terms of progress pertaining to soil health. So insects are vitally important. Remember what we said earlier? You should have more than 800 pounds of insects for every acre of healthy soil. And with insects, you're going to have predators, right? And predators often come in the form of spiders. And so this is what you should see out in your fields. Yesterday, as the sun was getting low out at Jonathan's place, and we were standing out in the fields, exactly, the fields were absolutely covered with spider webs. That's precisely what I want to see. Now, in a workshop I did a few months ago up in Wisconsin or Minnesota, one of those two places, I showed this picture, and there was a lady in the audience that she said, ooh, spiders, I have to have spiders to have healthy soil. You know, she just couldn't wrap her mind around the concept of her pastures needed to be full of spiders. But earthworms. So we should see lots of earthworms. Now, I did a workshop back in early November down in South Texas, and we actually had somebody there, a gentleman attending, that said, we don't have earthworms down here. They don't exist down here. He said, when I was a kid and I wanted to go fishing, I had to go buy my earthworms. We couldn't dig up any earthworms. And I said, how long have y'all been farming all of this land? Oh, you know, since before I was born. So, did they not have earthworms, or was that an indictment on their agricultural practices for all of those decades? And I would venture to guess this gentleman was in his 60s. Okay, so rather that was an indictment on their agricultural practices over that time period. Dung beetles. We should see dung beetles returning to our pastures. And there's multiple types of dung beetles. There's three main classes. There's tunnelers or drillers. Then there's the dwellers. And then there's the biggest dung beetles, the rollers or the tumblers. And all three species or classes are vital to us. This is an example of the tunnelers or drillers working in a manure pat. And this was a client of mine that just started a couple of years ago with adaptive grazing. He had never in his life seen dung beetles on his farm. And so he started noticing these strange occurrences in his manure patties. So he called me up one day and said, I'm not sure what's going on here. And I said, well, take some pictures and send them to me. And this is what he sent. And I said, well, you got dung beetles. And he was absolutely thrilled and overjoyed that dung beetles had finally showed up on his farm. And in 3 to 4 days, his manure patties would completely disappear. Now, what's that going to do for your fly cycle? It's going to break your fly cycle, right? You're going to have far less fly issues in your livestock when you have dung beetles present like this. This is an example of some of the different species of dung beetles. There's dozens of different types of dung beetles out there, but if you have a thriving population, you should be seeing dung beetles of at least half a dozen to a dozen or more different species or subspecies. We're also seeing the return of pollinator insects. And as Jonathan said, that is something that is absolutely vital to our very lives. So, what we should be seeing, is a vast array of insects. Now, here's something else that we should be seeing, though, and that is a significant increase in our soil aggregate layer. And this is another thing that we're having an issue with all over North America. In the bottom left-hand picture there, that's a microscopic view of soil aggregates. And you can see all of the pore spaces that are created there for oxygen to be held in the soil and for water to be held in the soil. So basically, our soil aggregates are the lungs of our soil. This is what healthy soil should look like. And we actually saw this yesterday at the Cobb's farm. They had a lot of deeper aggregate layer. I call it the cottage cheese appearance. It has those little curd-like appearance. That's due to the mycorrhizal fungi producing that soil glue that then sticks those finer soil particles together. And you can see from this, you've got an incredible amount of pore space for water infiltration and for oxygen infiltration into the soil. What we're finding across North America is that our soil aggregate layers on many of our pastures and row crop fields is less than an inch deep now. And I'm even finding this in states like Illinois and Iowa and Indiana and Ohio and eastern Nebraska and so forth. Soil aggregate layer less than an inch. And Unfortunately, in South Texas, folks, several of you, your homes, I've been finding soil aggregate layers of less than a ½ inch. Okay? So we've got to rebuild that. The good news is that it doesn't take near as long as you think, and we'll talk about how to do that. As I said, we do a lot of soil testing, but not just soil fertility or chemistry. That is such a minor snapshot of what's going on in your soil and what you really need to know. But yet, since the 1960s, that's been our gold standard with our land-grant universities and so forth, that we rely solely on a soil chem panel to tell us what's going on in our soil and inform us about what we need to be doing in terms of fertility as farmers and ranchers. Less than 20% of what we really need to know we've been relying on for 6 decades. Here's the other thing though. When you take a core soil sample, how deep are you taking it? How deep are you told to take it? 6 to 8 inches, right? So think about this, folks. We've made all of our soil fertility decisions for the last 6 decades based on only the top 6 inches of soil? Really? Really? That's what we've done. All of our research, all of our conclusions, everything are based on that. But yet, what goes on deeper, in the deeper strata of the soil, is just as critical. And we need to know biology. So we do a lot of soil biology testing. Now, the tests that I have up here have been great tests. I've used them for years, but they all have some limitations. So we're now using a lab in Illinois called Quorum that just recently had a multi-million-dollar addition that allows us to be able to look a lot deeper. So both on the soil chem panel, they can look at active and inactive fractions. In other words, both available and bound soil elements, which is critical to know. And in terms of soil biology, they're able to tell us not only the active fraction of the soil biology, which is what we get from a Sovita CO2 test or from the PLFA test, but now they're able to tell us that inactive or sporulated fraction, or what our true microbial potential is in the soil. And because they have metagenomic and proteogenomic and PCR capabilities, they're able to tell us the specific bacterial, protozoal, and fungal species that exist in that soil. So now we can go much deeper, and so our discovery process is going to take another leap forward because of these enhanced capabilities. We do a lot of in-field measurements as well. So I want to know your physical characteristics of your soil. So we measure your compaction using penetrometers. We measure your soil temperature using soil thermometers and also forward-looking infrared cameras or FLIR cameras. We look at water infiltration rates using double-ring infiltrometers. We measure available soil nitrogen using 3 meters. We take a look at your soil aggregate layer, and we measure plant bricks to get a starting point and to see what's going on there. This is measuring soil water infiltration rates using a double-ring infiltrometer. It's a quick and easy process. Unfortunately, again, what we're finding even in fields in Iowa and other places is that a lot of our water infiltration rates are now less than a ½ inch an hour. Now think about the ramifications of that. That means that for every inch of rain that you receive on your farm or your ranch, your soil is only able to infiltrate 2/10 or less. And the rest of it is ponding and pooling and then running off. So you're losing 80% of every inch of rain that falls on your farms and ranches. So an inch is not an inch. It's just like Gabe Brown said in the video there. It's not what we get. It's how much we can keep in our soils that's important. And our problem now is that we're not keeping it. We're sending it on down the road. That's why our river flow rates, folks, have increased 400-fold over the last several decades because we're not keeping our rainfall anymore. We use penetrometers to measure soil compaction. And so I want to ask you this question: can we control runoff with organic matter? Well, consider this: at 2% organic matter, our soils can hold only 21% of a moderate to heavy rainfall. But yet at 8% organic matter, now we can hold 85% of that same rainfall. So as we continually degrade our soils and lower the soil organic matter, it's precisely what I just said. We're keeping less and less of every inch of rainfall. But as we improve that soil aggregate layer and organic matter, now we can hold much more of that rainfall. And NRCS data tells us that for every 1% increase in soil organic matter, every acre can hold an additional 25,000 to 32,000 gallons of water. That's highly important to us. So let's talk about specific strategies that we can use to be able to rapidly build soil organic matter, significantly increase that soil aggregate layer, and improve complexity and diversity in everything from soil microbial life to plant life to insect life to wildlife. So we're going to talk first about adaptive grazing, and we sort of introduced it yesterday at the field day, and I know a number of you in here do practice adaptive grazing. But the first thing I want to say about it is this: it is goal-oriented, okay? Goal-oriented. And it's reliant on stock density, not stocking rate. Management and flexibility are key. In other words, it's not a rigid system, and don't make one out of it. If you do things the same way every day, every month, every year, you're going to stagnate, period. Period. You're going to stagnate. You have to shake things up. That's what adaptive grazing is all about. It's about not doing things the same way day in and day out, month in and month out. We stress frequent movement and rest of our paddocks, so frequent movement of our livestock, give our paddocks plenty of rest. We heavily stress root system recovery, and it's highly reliant, at least in the eastern portion of the U.S., basically from here east, on temporary fencing technology. Now, I work with a lot of ranchers out on western rangelands where we're grazing across anywhere from hundreds of thousands to more than 1 million acres. And we're not going to string polywire across that broad expanse, right? So, what do we do there? Well, we rely on cowboys. Okay, we rely on cowboys. And depending on where you are, you know, they're called cowboys in some areas. In Nevada and Utah, the Mormon cowboys are called buckaroos. And in Mexico, you know, we call them vaqueros, right? So we're working in all of those regions, and we employ cowboys in all of those regions to move our cattle for us to have the same high stock density, frequent movement, long rest impact that we can implement using polywire and putting it up and taking it down. Now, there's one thing about a cowboy. They only want to do one thing. They want to sit on their horse, right? You put them afoot, and they complain and complain and complain. So, as long as they can stay on that horse all day long, they're happy. So we found a way to make them happy. Move cattle every day. Live with the cattle, move cattle every day. You know, actually, further east here in Texas and all of that, if you could figure out a way to string polywire paddocks from horseback, you could get a lot of cowboys to do that for you here. But now, here's one other thing, and I'm gonna repeat this numerous times today. Nothing that we do in agriculture is singular or linear. I'm going to say that one more time. Nothing we do in agriculture is singular or linear. And as a matter of fact, nothing that we do in life is, if we're honest with ourselves. Let me give you an example. How many men in here are married or have girlfriends? Okay? All right? If you say the wrong thing to your wife or girlfriend, is that ever singular? No. It has compounding, cascading effects that last for a very long time, right? And boy, the next time you have an argument, she remembers the last one, right? So compounding, cascading effects. Okay? So everything that we do has compounding, cascading effects in agriculture, either for the good or for the bad. And that's what we have to realize. Nothing is singular. And I'll talk more and more about that as we go along. So what does high stock density grazing look like? Let's start in the upper left-hand corner and work clockwise around. So in the upper left-hand corner, that's about 250,000 pounds per acre. In the upper right, that's 100,000 pounds per acre. In the lower left, that's 500,000 pounds per acre. And in the lower right, that's 1 million pounds per acre. Now, would I go at any of those stock densities all the time, every day? No. Otherwise, it's not adaptive, is it? I'm doing things the same way all the time, and I'm going to stagnate. Okay? Each of those has a purpose and an intent. And throughout the year, I'm going to employ many different stock densities on my own farm to achieve specific sets of goals. And really what we're trying to do is simulate what occurred through many thousands of years with nature, with our large wild ruminant populations. So we're trying to create both biomimicry and ecomimicry impacts. And we do that today. We don't have the large herds of wild ruminants anymore that are free to roam. Everything's cut up and confined. We got fences, roads, houses, buildings, everything. So we use domesticated livestock to do that for us today. So we use them to nurture ecological memory. And observation is critically important. We want to observe the behavior of our animals each day, their performance each day, the plant performance, and what's happening with our soil and our soil level organisms. In other words, observation, daily observation, is the very best tool that you have to be successful at this. And flexibility is the key. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later. But you want to do things like alter stock densities, change your rotation patterns through your farms and ranches, alter grazing height on and off, alter the rest periods, and if you do multi-species grazing, alter species order. So how rapidly can we build new soil organic matter using adaptive grazing? This is just a smattering of our data. We have far more than this, but I wanted to give you a snapshot of what we have found. You see the different states that are represented here, and then we go from year 1 to year 5. So year 1 will be the year that adaptive grazing was first implemented on these different operations. After 5 years in all of these cases, you can see that we made significant progress in being able to grow new soil organic matter. But we also said that our microbial population is critically important. And so likewise, we also have been monitoring the soil microbial population, and we measure that in nanograms per gram of soil. The yellow bar here represents year 1, the year that we began adaptive grazing on these different operations. The green bars represent year 5 and how far we were able to come in building that soil microbial population in just a short 5-year time period. Now, I want you to think about this microbial population like this. Many of you, this is a little foreign to you thinking in these terms, especially nanograms per gram and all of that. Who thinks about that on a daily basis? None of us. So think about the nanograms per gram like you think about fertilizer. How many people in here grow corn? Okay, what's the rule of thumb? How many pounds of nitrogen are required to grow a bushel of corn? Okay, it's about a 1-to-1 relationship, right? It's going to have a range about 0.8 to 1.2 or 3, right? But on the whole, it's going to be about a 1-to-1 relationship. Okay? So, Dan, if you wanted to grow 200 bushel an acre corn, then how much nitrogen do you need? Well, yeah, and it depends on what's in the soil, but total though, counting what's in the soil, everything, you need at least 200 pounds, right? Okay? Now, if you only had 20, what's going to happen? You're not going to come anywhere close to producing 200 bushel an acre corn, are you? Okay? So think about this microbial population in the soil in the same manner. If I have 1,000 nanograms per gram, 600 nanograms per gram in my soil, that's like having the 20 pounds of nitrogen. I'm not even going to come close to achieving my objectives in terms of productivity and so forth from my soil. But if I can build to 8, 10, 12,000 nanograms per gram of microbial activity in my soil, now that's analogous to the 200 pounds of nitrogen to grow 200 bushel an acre corn. And we do that by doing this. We use high stock densities to be able to create carbon, new organic matter, socking carbon in the soil. This is the type of trample that we desire. Now, a lot of people, when they see either these pictures or they see it at our operation or somebody else's operation, their immediate thought is, boy, how do you have wasted a ton of grass. I can't believe you did that. Why did you waste all that grass? I didn't waste anything. I have just built new soil. I have just socked a lot of carbon into the soil, and I'm going to show you some data later that's going to show you just how rapidly we can do that with this type of grazing methodology. So here's another thing that we pay a lot of attention to is how much of each plant can we take on a single grazing before we significantly impact root growth. So we can go up to 50% leaf volume removal and have no more than 2% root growth stoppage. But look what happens if we increase that just another 10%. And we want to say, well, surely just 10% more. That can't have very much of an impact. Well, we go from 2 to 4% root growth stoppage all the way up to 50% root growth stoppage. And if we allow our livestock to get into the 80% or so take rate, now we have 100% root growth stoppage. And here's why that's important. Okay, you look at these pictures, you look up there at the A frame, and you see that if we allow our livestock to closely crop down our pastures, what happens to the roots? They die off, right? But they not only die off, the living portion of the root moves up much closer to the soil surface. So here we go, folks, compounding cascading effects that I talked about earlier. Nothing is singular. So what's all the compounding cascading effects occurring here? All right, first of all, we have left very little solar panel on our plant for plant recovery, for photosynthetic activity to occur in plant recovery, right? So it's automatically going to take that plant longer to recover because we've removed most of its solar panel. Secondly, if it turns off hot and dry and those roots have died off up closer to the soil surface, you're in real trouble. And those pastures are not going to recover very rapidly at all, And that's a long-term mistake. Remember yesterday out in the field, I talked about when we make mistakes, we want them to be very short-term and immediately correctable. Well, that's a long-term mistake that's going to last for the whole season or maybe even years. The other thing is, where do the microbes live? In the roots, right? Okay, in the root zone. So if we shrink the root zone, we've also shrunk our microbial population. That means we've also shrunken our soil aggregate layer. That means we've also lowered the amount of soil that's going to be fully oxygenated and holding water. See how this gets to be compounding and cascading very quickly? So I want to give you a case study here, and if you've heard me speak before over the last 2 or 3 years at least, you've seen this. But for those of you that haven't, this was an opportunity that we had. My partner and I down in Mississippi that I ranch with had an opportunity to acquire some land that was adjacent to some other land that we had, and so it made it a strategic purchase. And this is what it looked like at the time of purchase. It was the fall of that year, and just a little bit of history on this piece of property. It had been in pretty much continuous cultivation for about 150 plus years, and in Mississippi, many of those years would have been what? Cotton. And what does cotton do to soil? Destroys it. Okay? So it had been in a lot of, almost continuous cultivation, used up. And it's also important to know that because we're going to talk about the latent seed bank in a little bit, and I want you to know that that latent seed bank hadn't been tapped for more than 150 years. Okay? Now, for a handful of years ahead of us purchasing this property, it was owned by Mossy Oak. How many people know who Mossy Oak is? One of the largest outdoor companies, started as a camouflage company, all of that. And so they bought it as a hunting property. They planted their food plots all over it and everything, and the hunting was so pathetic that they decided they would sell it. The biggest deer they could harvest off of there during the interim period that they had it was a 120 class, and that would have been a huge deer at that point in time for them. But we viewed this, we'd been doing all this adaptive grazing, with clients all over North America. We knew what our results had been, and we've been collecting a lot of data. But this was an opportunity to start literally from ground zero and collect data from baseline forward and to continuously track what was happening as we applied certain management practices, as well as keep an ongoing pictorial diary. So I've got literally thousands and thousands of pictures through the years looking at this. So this was our starting point. Our soil organic matters range from 1.3 to 1.6. So pretty pathetic. Water infiltration rates less than a ½ inch an hour. Plant bricks, and if you don't know what that is, I'll explain it later, was 2%, which is pathetic. Basically, bottom line is that meant that the forages that we measured there had very little nutrient density. Okay? We had forage specialists from Mississippi State and then NRCS come out and do an initial survey, and in terms of what's considered forage species, okay, and I do the air quotes for a reason on that, we're going to talk about that later, they could only count 3 to 4. And it's about a 1,000-acre property, so they can only count about 3 to 4 across that 1,000 acres. And the initial stocking rate, that first grazing season, we stocked at 1 cow-calf unit to 6 acres, which is not very good at all in our country. So the very first winter, we dropped cows in there that winter, and these were gestating cows getting ready to calve that next spring, so we bale grazed them. And I'll show you pictures of bale grazing a little later, but basically we just set bales out about every 25 foot apart, and through the winter controlled their access to them. The first grazing season, we used high stock density, short duration grazing with long rest periods. This is what it looked like during the year one grazing season. What do you see growing there? Be honest. You can say it. Weeds, okay. Weeds. Well, folks, I'll tell you, we had weeds, and more weeds. You know, we had ragweed, giant ragweed, sumac, ironweed, pigweed, milkweed, multiple species of milkweed, multiple species of thistle, on and on and on. We had blackberry, we had dewberry, we had ash, we had cedar. You know, you name it, it was all there across that landscape the first year. So that's what our cattle had to eat. That's what they had to rely on. One thing I want you to know as we go through this series of pictures, we did no mechanical intervention. We applied no fertilizer or lime. We did no herbicide spraying of any sort, and we planted nothing. Okay? Now, this, remember I said I used to be on faculty at the university? And if I would have done research like this at the university, guess what? That would have come out of your pockets, the taxpayers' pockets, right? And it, frankly, whether it worked or not, would not have affected my paycheck. But here, this affected my wallet, my bottom line. So if we made a mistake, it was on us. There were no taxpayer-funded dollars paying for this, okay? So that's what we did the first year. Now, high stock density, grazing the weeds, we had a lot of people, including my very good friend, Dr. Gordon Hazard, that first year said, Alan, you're going to starve those cows to death. And frankly, we didn't know whether we would or not. Okay? And we were prepared, if we had to move the cows off this place, we were prepared to do that. But guess what happened? They started calving in April, and we calve in April and May. So they started calving in April and May, and the cows just picked up body condition. They kept gaining body condition off of weeds. And we kept wondering, wow, what's happening here? So we pulled tissue samples from all of these different weed species that we had in there, and we pulled tissue samples from the improved variety of forages that were there, what few were there, and we sent them to the Mississippi State Forage Lab, and guess what we found? In every case, the weeds were significantly better in nutrient analysis than the improved variety forages. Every single one was better. They were better in crude protein, they were better in TDN, they were better in net energies, they were better in RFQs, and in terms of mineral content, they were better to the tune of 4 to 8-fold than the improved variety forages there. Why? Why? Explain that to me. Why in the world would they have been so much better in mineral content? It's actually not a hard answer. Most weeds are far deeper rooted than the improved variety forages, right? So they were reaching, over all of those years of continuous cultivation, what had happened? All of that farming and all of that had essentially mined out a lot of the mineral in the top strata of soil, right? But yet, because they were growing monocultures all of that time, roots weren't reaching deeper into the ground. So with these weeds, they were reaching down into the strata beneath that layer and pulling up minerals that were not in the top strata. So they were much more highly mineralized than the forages that had roots only in that top strata. We found they would also graze our trees along the wood lines and eat the leaves, and they loved those. And so my grandkids would help me. Those are my grandboys there, and they would help me routinely. And here's what the paddocks would look like when the cattle would come out. The giant ragweed, ironweed, all of that, they'd strip the leaves off of the stalks of those plants. And a lot of them can be 6, 8 foot tall, okay, where we are. And so they would strip all the leaves. Now, in our country, and I've noticed them here as well, we have those nasty little critters called fire ants, okay? And guess what? Fire ants love ironweed. You know the little purple blossoms at the top of ironweed? Fire ants love those. Okay? So they climb up the stalks of the ironweed and feed on the nectar of those blossoms up there. And you can have hundreds and hundreds of fire ants up in those blossoms for every ironweed plant. My grandsons discovered that very quickly because they would take the Ranger and they would, as they would drive through the pastures and they would hit that ironweed, they would fling fire ants all over themselves. And I could be a long way away and know that they had done it. You know, you'd hear the screaming and they'd be shucking clothes and everything else trying to get rid of the fire ants, you know. And so to this day, my grandkids don't call ironweed, they call it antweed. And they live in New Orleans, and every time they come up to visit, they'll spend about a month with us every summer, and every time they come up to visit, before they'll go drive in the pastures, they'll say, "Pawpaw, there's none of that antweed out there, is there?" So they watch out for that stuff. But so this is year 2, okay? Well, there we go, okay? And again, we planted nothing, didn't apply anything, no fertilizer, no chemicals, nothing else. So do you see a difference starting to appear? So it's from year 1 to year 2, we start to see a difference, right? This is year 3. This is year 4. So in 4 years, that's what occurred. Now let me show you from a data standpoint what happened. Remember we started at 1.3 to 1.6 range in organic matter? In 4 years, we were at 5.2 to 5.6. We had the same folks come in from Mississippi State and NRCS and assess our forage species, and they counted at the end of year 4 more than 43, including natives that had come up from the latent seed bank. And that included things like blue stem, Indian grass, eastern gamma grass, Illinois bundleflower, and so forth. Plant bricks went from a 2% in those technically forage species to between 15 and 22%. Water infiltration rates increased to 10 plus inches an hour. Our stocking rate decreased from requiring 6 acres per animal unit down to 1.5 acres at the end of year 4. That's free acres, folks, free acres. We didn't have to buy more land to add more cattle, to add more productivity. We also saw significant increases in all of our soil level organisms, like earthworms, insects, pollinators, and even our wildlife species. Now here's one thing we believe in very strongly. I stressed this yesterday at the field day. Keep your soil covered, protect your soil moisture, protect your soil temperature. When you allow cattle to crop down close or in row crop fields where we don't have our ground covered with the cover crop residue, it's too easy for soil temperatures to rise well above 100 degrees. And this happens in the summer. It doesn't matter whether you're here in South Texas or whether you're up in Canada. All of the soils between here and there can easily reach well into the hundreds if they're exposed to the sunlight and not shaded and sheltered. And here's why that's so critical. At 70 degrees soil temperature, 100% of soil moisture is still available for plant growth and regrowth and microbial support. At 100 degrees, we have now lost 85% of our soil moisture, and only 15% is still available for plant growth and regrowth. At 115 degrees, our microbes begin to break down, and at 140, we have pasteurized them. Okay? So that's why protecting that soil temperature is so critical. Now, using forward-looking infrared technology, we're able to do some pretty cool things out there in assessing soil temperatures. Now, we took this summer here in Texas. This was in a pasture that was being conventionally grazed. And when you conventionally graze, what happens? The cattle get very selective, right? And so they'll graze down pretty tight those areas that they favor, and they'll leave those other areas alone. And so you'll have these tufts of grass interspersed with tightly grazed patches. Everybody's seen that. So that's what we're seeing here. Where you see the blues, that's where we have much cooler soil temperature. So you can see down there in the blue area, the soil temperature was 87 degrees. So we still had soil moisture, and we still had living, active soil microbes. But just a few feet away, where you see the yellows and the reds, the soil temperature was 133 degrees. So we had just killed our soil microbes, and we had just done away with all our soil moisture. So it's that easy. Now here's another thing that we look at. As we move cattle more frequently, we also have much more even application throughout our entire farms or ranches of manure and urine for fertilization purposes. If we continuous graze, it takes 27 years to get 1 square yard of manure pat, or 1 manure pat for every square yard of pasture. 27 years. If we move them once a day, every day, it only takes a year to achieve that same thing. Now, to help us with our grazing and to know what we're doing and to keep accurate records so that we can know what to do year in and year out based on what we did the year prior, we use Pasture Map app. We found this. You can load it on your smartphones, you can load it on your tablets, that type of thing, and it works very well. You can go to their website, just pasturemap.com, and check them out, and you can download it, the app, and try it out for free, okay, before you sign up, and it's a fee-based type deal depending on the amount of usage and all of that, but they've done a superior job of developing this. So here's what we're after now. Just like Jonathan emphasized diversity and complexity in insect species, I want diversity and complexity in plant species. And guess what? The good news is they come hand in hand. Okay? If you have one, you're pretty much guaranteed you're going to have the other. And here's why. When I have a monoculture above the ground, I have a monoculture of roots below the ground. So I'm limiting everything. I'm limiting my compounding cascading effects for the positive. I'm limiting my microbial population. I'm limiting my insect population. I'm limiting the nutritional options that my livestock have. I'm limiting the options, the food source options that my wildlife have. I'm limiting the degree of organic matter I can build. I'm limiting the aggregate layer that I can build in my soil. I'm limiting the amount of mycorrhizal fungi I can have in my soil. Compounding, cascading effects. But when I have complexity and diversity, now look at what happens. Look at the incredible root structure that you have beneath the ground. And why is that important? Because where do the majority of microbes live and function? Well, in the root zone, as we said earlier. So the more root I create in the ground, the more microbes I can support in the ground. And here's another reason I want to grow a lot of roots. It's because 2/3 of organic matter increase that we get comes from those very roots. So that's what we're after. That's what we want to achieve. So here's my desired mix. I call it the principle of 3. This is what I want in every pasture or in every cover crop mix. And there's a reason that we have settled on this, because our data, our research clearly shows us this is creating the type of diversity and complexity that allows us to achieve the most rapid results in soil building and building microbial populations. So whether I'm growing a perennial pasture mix or a cover crop, I want 3 different plant classes represented at all times: grasses, legumes, and forbs. Now, if you're a weed scientist or a forage specialist, what are you going to call those forbs? Weeds, right? You're going to call them weeds. I call them forages. And I call them medicine for my livestock. And I call them soil builders. I want forbs. Now, oftentimes today we think that a native prairie is grasses only or predominantly grasses. Folks, that is not the way it was. Okay? That is not the way it was. We think we're restoring native prairie when we just go out and plant a bunch of native tall grasses. No, we're only restoring a third of what that native prairie was. And you'll find, and we've measured it, Russ and I have done some of these measurements, when you go out there and measure, quote, native prairies that are nothing but native tallgrass species, you actually have a lack of diversity, a lack of life. Okay? Not this incredible plethora of life that Jonathan Lundgren was talking about. Okay? So this is what I want to see, but even more importantly, I don't want to see just one grass and one legume and one forb species represented. I want to see at least 3 of each of those compounding, cascading effects. Okay? So I want to see all 3 represented. So this is what I want prime pastures to look like. If it's native prairie, it's going to be different than that. But I want to see legumes, forbs, and grasses represented in all of them, in multiple species of all of those. We can create the same with warm season cocktail mixes, with cool season cocktail mixes. So why complexity and diversity? Well, again, because I'm trying to create positive compounding and cascading effects. And again, they always occur whether for the positive or the negative. Our job as a manager is to make sure they're positive. One reason is that I want as many secondary and tertiary chemical compounds being produced by my plants as possible. How many people have heard Dr. Fred Provenza speak? Okay, a handful of you. Now Fred, he's a professor emeritus at Utah State, but he has done a lot of the seminal research in looking at plant secondary and tertiary chemical compounds. And here's the deal with those. First of all, we all know about the primary nutrient compounds that plants produce. We've done forage analysis, that kind of thing, and when we get those results back, we're looking at the primary. But I seriously doubt any of you have sent off samples where they've done an analysis for secondary and tertiary chemical compounds. But here's why they're so important. First of all, every plant species produces a different array of secondary and tertiary compounds. They don't all produce the same secondary and tertiary compounds. Secondly, those secondary and tertiary compounds are critical in terms of medicinal benefit to your livestock. Where do most of our pharmaceutical products derive? From plants, right? From plants collected around the world. And they isolated specific secondary or tertiary chemical compounds from those plants to create a pharmaceutical for us. Okay? Well, why in the world doesn't that apply to our livestock? Well, of course it does. Of course it does. And if we have monoculture or near monoculture pastures, we are automatically limiting not only the nutrients available to those livestock, but we are also automatically limiting the medicinal opportunities for those animals to self-medicate on a daily basis. And here's another thing about a lot of those secondary and tertiary chemical compounds in plants. They also have anti-parasitic properties. So you won't have to deworm and those types of things. We've been able to do that. We've been able to totally do away with deworming of any class of livestock because of a diverse array of secondary and tertiary chemical compounds. And here's one thing I want you to do when you go home. Go out into your fields, and if you have to go out into the ditches to do it, do it. If you got to go into your ditches to find the array of species that you need to be looking at. But take grasses, the blades of your grasses, and just, sort of ball them up and roll them around in your hand to break up the cell walls, and then smell the aroma. Then take your legumes, clovers, whatever, and do the same thing. Then take forbs and do the same thing. Always, with the forbs, they're going to be much more aromatic. much more aromatic. The grasses are going to have sort of a sweet, sugary smell, and it's going to be just a slight aroma. The legumes are going to have an intermediate aroma, but still sort of sweet smelling. But the forbs are going to be very aromatic and distinctly different from each other. What's creating that strong, and it's pleasing, it's not a put-off aroma, but what's creating that very strong aroma? Secondary, tertiary chemical compounds. So do that when you go home and take a notice of that. That's a direct indicator of the amount of secondary and tertiary compounds that are in there. So again, with diversity and complexity in our plant species, we also create diversity and complexity in our microbial species and our soil level microorganisms. And remember, it's exponential rather than linear. If you want to produce exponential benefits on your farms and ranches, you can only do that through complexity and diversity. We can't do it, as Jonathan said earlier, from a sack or from a can of chemicals. We can't do it. Okay, so we've talked about the secondary and tertiary compounds. This is an example, and not everything in here are perennials, but a lot of these are annuals that will seed and reproduce themselves year after year. I work also with a lot of grass-fed dairy operations throughout the U.S., and this is the type of mix that we're looking at for optimum production on grass-fed dairies. And you can see that we have our principle of 3 following through here, right? We have grasses, legumes, and forbs represented, but then multiple species of grasses, legumes, and forbs also represented in those pastures. So what you're seeing here is a very diverse array of plant species. And that produces dairies that thrive. In your annuals, we want the same thing. Highly diverse, complex mixes following that principle of 3. You know, in Green Cover Seeds website, I always tell people, you know, whether you buy seed from them or not, use their Smart Mix Calculator because it's the best tool on the market to help you design your mix. It's very easy to move the mob, you know, as we call it. The cattle move themselves. For any of you that have done this for any period of time, you know how super easy it is to train the cattle. And it's so easy that we can do this. On that farm that I was describing earlier that we purchased, it's about 2 miles from the east end to the west end. And we had the cattle way over on the east end grazing, and I wanted to move them all the way to the west end to start my rotations back. And so all I had to do was get on the Ranger. You know, we didn't require horses, dogs, a bunch of people, anything. Just me by myself, or my son can do it, or my grandkids can do it on the Ranger. What the cattle will do is they'll line up and follow you wherever you go. And they won't stop till I stop. Okay? And so across that 2 miles, they were coming across areas that had not been grazed for quite a while and were pretty lush. But yet they didn't stick their heads down and graze and stop. As long as I kept moving, they trusted that I had something even better for them, waiting on them. And they kept following me. And so they followed me all the way. The bottom left-hand picture is when I stopped and got off the Ranger, and there's a gap gate right there, polywire gap gate. And I waited till the stragglers, you can see they spread out in a long line. I waited for the stragglers to catch up and then opened it up, and on the bottom right, that's them filtering into the new paddock. Now, there's simple and easy ways if we want to do multiple moves a day, and you don't want to be there. You saw this in the video with Neil Dennis. We can use bat latches with either spring gates or bungee gates. I like the bungee gates better. The spring gates oftentimes can tend to backlash and get all coiled up on you. The bungee gates won't do that, so I prefer the bungee versus a spring when you're using bat latches. But we have a series of 5 bat latches. You may not can see the others set up going down through that field there, but we have a series of 6 paddocks set up with 5 bat latches set up for the dividers set to go off at intervals of time. And the cattle, you don't have to be there. The cattle move themselves into the next paddock throughout that day of grazing. This is another very quick and easy way to do it. You know, we just can quickly reel out and subdivide our paddocks and then real quickly reel up each spool of wire to allow the cattle to be able to move into the next paddock for multi-moves a day. This is a fencing rig that I use. You know, I double deck my Ranger. I've got my bed subdivided. I use 3 different types of post. I use ring top post. I use T-post for severe corners and things like that I can drive in, and I can you know, have tension pulled on with my polywire. And for long runs, a lot of times to save on my ring top post, I'll use the 3/8 inch 4-foot fiberglass post that I just couple of taps, or even in soft soil you can just push those in. And then the upper deck, I keep my, you know, reels of wire and gate handles, those types of things up there, so it makes it very easy. Now here's the deal, folks. This is so easy to do, okay, that even my kids and grandkids can do this without any problem. And so you can use it as a teaching tool for your kids. Now I want to ask you this. Any of you ever had a kid that you just had a discipline problem with? No? Nobody's used to that. Well, our youngest grandson happens to be one of those kids. And, you know, he's one of those kids that no form of discipline phases him. You know, we've tried spanking, doesn't work. You know, he just laughs. You know, timeouts, doesn't work. Take away his video games, doesn't work. You know, nothing. So we kept searching for what would get his attention, what would be a really good method of discipline. And it wasn't until we found this that we finally discovered something that would work. So these are grass-fed dairies in the upper Midwest. No, actually, that's in New York State. But again, just showing, you know, we have a lot of diversity and complexity in those pastures. Now, we do keep our cattle out of our ponds and so forth. We don't let them get in the ponds, and this is how we do it. We just ring all our ponds with a single strand of polywire, and we've gone in and we used a track hoe or an excavator to build ramps into our ponds. We built them 12 foot wide, went down and laid geotextile fabric down and rocked over top of that. And so the rock extends into the pond, and in the bottom right picture, you can see that we've got polywire into the pond so they can walk down the ramp, and they're still on that hard surface rock, even in the pond there, and drink, so they don't muddy it up, they don't muck it up, they don't linger, anything like that. And again, it's only 12 foot wide. We don't want it wider because we want them taking turns going down to drink, okay? And that's now in NRCS approved protocol, okay? We were their experiment for that, and that's now in NRCS approved protocol. You can actually get EQIP funding to do that, okay? And we do a lot of stockpile grazing in the winter. We stockpile a lot of warm season perennials for our cattle in the winter. We have cool season perennials as well, but we take advantage of stockpiling warm season perennials. And this was back in January of 2016, just moving our cows onto that warm season stockpile. It holds up very well, and they do extremely well on it. Now, here's the deal. I'm going to ask you, who is the employee on your ranch or farm? You or your livestock? You know, I want my livestock to be my employee. I don't want to be their employee. And too often, unintentionally, we become their employee. We do their bidding rather than making them work. Now, this is, I'm going to show you just some real quick examples here of different farms that we've worked with. This was Pompey's Rest Farm in South Carolina. This is just after a single year of adaptive grazing, what he was able to achieve. This is what his farm looked like when we first started working with him, and he said this is what it's looked like the last 30 years. So we implemented adaptive grazing, and that's what it looked like after the first grazing season. He made the comment that he's never seen grass that lush on his farm in the last 30 years. So a single year of adaptive grazing, that's what he was able to achieve. No, sir, that was just what came up. what came up. This is some work that we've been working with Green Acres Research Farm up in Ohio, and this is some work that they're doing. So they're looking at cover crop livestock integration into row cropping situations. And so they're looking at year-round rotations of cover crops in between cash crops. And so this was a warm season cocktail mix that was planted. And you can see moving from one paddock to the other. 55 days after planting the cocktail mix, they had 8,500 pounds per acre dry matter available for grazing. And over a 120-day grazing period, the steers gained right at 3 pounds per day. No fertilizer or starter fertilizer was applied. And after recovery from the first grazing, on the second grazing, they had 4,500 pounds of dry matter available for that grazing. So they planted an 18-species warm season mix, and here's what happened in just 120 days. Okay? Soil organic matter increased from 3.6 to 4.4, a gain of 0.8% in 120 days. They added 20,000 gallons per acre water holding capacity in 120 days. This project is being conducted over 100 acres, so multiplied over that 100 acres, that's an additional 2 million gallons of water holding capacity. The soil nitrogen increased 58 pounds per acre. Soil mineral value increased more than $100 per acre over that time period. The soil microbial activity increased 44%, and earthworms increased to more than 130,000 per acre in their counts in 120 days. In a Penn State trial, they compared a 2-seed perennial mix to a 5-seed perennial mix. Now, the 2-seed was orchard grass and white clover. The 5-seed was orchard grass, white clover, fescue, alfalfa, and chicory. So they at least, to a certain degree, yes, sir. How much rain did they get? It was a little more than normal because of the year. You know, it was this year. Okay? I would have to go back and look on the records to see what it was. But it was about, if I remember correctly, about 11% above what they normally would have received during that same time span. Yes, sir. Now, this will be repeated, so we'll have, you know, year-over-year data to continue to look at on this. Now, if it were my country during that same, I didn't get any rain from July till just earlier this week. So that would have been the difference. But all right, so they followed the principle of 3 somewhat that I espouse here. They, you know, the 5-seed mix, they didn't have 3 of each, but at least they had the 3 main classes, grasses, legumes, forbs, represented. They did a 9-year trial, and so the only difference was whether they planted a 2-seed mix or a 5-seed mix in these pastures. They grazed them the same way over the 9 years. At the end of the 9 years, in tabulating their data, what they found was in the 5-seed mix, and to me, that's not aggressive at all. Okay, that's sort of bare minimum. But yet, comparing just 2 to 5, they had 31% more forage dry matter production over the 9-year period. 31% more. Folks, how much more did it cost to plant 2-seed versus 5-seed, or 5-seed versus 2-seed? You know, to get 31% more forage and everything else was treated equally over that entire time period? 31% more. That's why with much more diverse mixes, we're seeing not 31% more, but 2.5 to 4-fold more. Okay? So as you up the diversity and complexity, you significantly improve that. Their soil organic carbon down to 39 inches in the 2-seed mix was bumping at around 0.5 ton per hectare, but in the 5-seed mix, they were socking in 1.8 tons per hectare. Significant difference. Okay, down in Mexico, some ranchers that we've worked with for quite a while, and I just want to show you some things that some of the guys down there have been able to do, the Las Tamas. This is a fence line comparison. The Las Tamas on the left, the neighbor's ranch on the right. 5 years ago, there was no difference on either side. The Las Tamas looked exactly like the neighbor's ranch 5 years ago. Again, the Las Tamas, you see some of the abundance of growth. And let me show you what kind of rainfall they were able to achieve that on. They're typically, they're in the state of Coahuila, they're typically an 11-inch rainfall region, but the last 4 years, 10, 9, 8, and 5. That's all. 5 years ago, they were predominantly a monoculture of tabasa grass outside of the brushy species growing there. Today, they have more than 4 dozen different forage species that have all showed up from the latent seed bank. They run across 150,000 acres off very rough terrain, so you're not planting anything there. So all of that was volunteer from the latent seed bank. Today, it takes some 40 acres to run a cow-calf unit. 5 years ago, it took 200 acres to do the same thing. On their neighbor's ranch, across the fence line, it still takes 200 acres. The only issue they have is that somehow their fence keeps getting cut and their neighbor's cattle keep getting on their ranch. This is the Luis Robles Ranch in Chihuahua. Again, a fence line comparison, adaptive versus conventional grazing. And here we lost the cowboy. The grass was so deep. But now actually what we wanted to show there was we just threw the hat out, but this is desert. Okay, understand, this is desert. And look at the density of that sward of grass growing out there. Many of the current generation never thought this was possible in that desert. Okay? This is the Cateras Cattle Company, again in the state of Chihuahua. He's standing in desert. Does that look like desert? You know, look at this. When I was in Nebraska a couple of weeks ago, I said, you know, this looks like Nebraska in the springtime. And this is the desert of northern Mexico. And this is how they achieve that. You can see the movement patterns by the yellow arrows as they move up and down this slope with their cattle in the paddocks. And you can see all the cattle in the paddock with the red arrow there. So that's where the cattle were on that particular day. So again, high stock density, frequent movement, long rest periods allowed them to be able to do this. So I'm going to ask you this question. Does grazing strategy and methodology matter? Well, I'm going to contend that it absolutely does. And another project I'm working on is a project with Team Soil Carbon. And what we're doing is we're going around North America and we're measuring what we call a triad of grazing operations. So in every area, we're looking for ranches or farms that have been adaptive grazing a minimum of 5 years. And then we're looking for operations that have been doing a slow rotation, you know, rotating every 1 week, 2 weeks, or every month for a minimum of 10 years, and then doing conventional grazing, where basically the cattle or continuous, where they can go wherever they want across that farm or ranch. And we're going in and digging at random locations soil pits that are 3 foot deep. And we're taking soil samples on the walls of those pits every 6-inch gradient down to 36 inches. And then doing an analysis on that. Well, here's what we found on our initial analysis. So the first data, the first triad of farms were in Mississippi. And so we used the farm that I just described earlier, where we've only been doing the high stock density on that farm for 5 years, so keep that in mind, and compared it to a farm that's been doing a slow rotation for 50 plus years, and then to a farm that for 30 plus years the cattle have just been able to go wherever they wanted and graze whatever they wanted. The soil strata, the horizon, number 1 would be the top 6 inches, and number 6 would be all the way down to 36 inches, that last 6 inches of soil. You can see that in terms of total soil carbon, after just 5 years of adaptive grazing on land that had been continuously cultivated, keep this in mind, continuously cultivated for 150 years before that, in just 5 years, we sought a significant amount of carbon into the ground all the way down to 3 feet. And that's what's so significant about this. All the way down to 3 feet compared to what you see out of 50 plus and 30 plus years of continuous grazing. The same thing with soil organic matter. And then if we look at carbon sequestration rates, we see that we sequestered significantly higher levels of carbon compared to the other two grazing strategies. Yes, sir. That's correct, yes, sir. Nothing. And we did that on purpose. We wanted to take that opportunity to see what can you do without all of the standard interventions. Okay? In other words, using livestock as our primary tool, what could we achieve? It was right at 1,000. It is 1,000 acres, right at 1,000. It's 998. No, sir. It's not a baby step. It could have cost us an awful lot of money. But instead, what it did was it saved us an awful lot of money. So think about this. And this was our 6th year of grazing that piece of property, that particular piece of property. Okay? So in 6 years, folks, I haven't spent a penny on fertilizer or lime. I haven't spent a penny on mowing anything. I haven't spent a penny on any seed. And I haven't spent a penny on any herbicide in 6 years. Also, I haven't spent any money on anthominics, dewormers. Also, I haven't spent any money on fly control. You start adding all of that up. And the only piece of equipment I crank, by the way, on a daily basis is the Ranger. Okay? So start adding all of that up, and you can see the ramifications of that financially very, very quickly. And when you consider that also, not only did we not spend all of that over that time period, but we added a whole lot more cattle. We started with about 120 head. Now we're at 683 cows. 6 years. Okay, think about the ramifications of being able to do that and multiply that across farm after farm, ranch after ranch, and the impact that has on our bottom line. So I'm going to finish up with this. Yes? Well, as you remember earlier, we grass finish, and market to, right. So also, we have taken control of our own market as well, all right? And I'm not controlled by the volatility of the commodity market. That's correct. We didn't just grow cattle. We grew very high quality. And again, you saw the pictures. We're growing choice and prime grass-fed beef. Yeah. So yes, ma'am. Yeah, and I'm going to talk a lot more about that tomorrow as well when we talk about how epigenetics and what your management influences what happens. But here's the deal. We routinely change things up, okay? So my stock, I never got below about 50,000 pounds stock density. That's about as low as I ever go, 50,000 pounds per acre, okay? But I went all the way up at times to 1 million, okay? And everywhere in between. So I was constantly changing stock densities. Now we do move every day, okay? And that's important to me. I like to move at least once every day, but if I'm going higher stock densities, then I'm going to be moving them multiple times a day, right? Okay? Yeah, so that, and we alter, what we do. So let me talk about this by using this. Okay, so principle of disruption, okay? This is very important to us. Again, I said earlier, do not settle into a routine. Do not settle into a pattern, okay, or a regimen, because that's when you stagnate and you stop making progress. Rather, You want to constantly introduce planned disruptions. And I assure you that with nature, with large wild ruminants and all of the fire caused by lightning and all of these other things, nature had disruptions, okay? Don't think nature was constant. Absolutely not. So we need planned disruptions. Now, this was not a planned disruption. This was an uh-oh, okay? This was a guy that was doing high stock density grazing, got caught in a sudden heavy downpour with a very high stock density on a small paddock, and they churned it up. And he called in a panic, what do I do? I'm going to have to reseed this. How do I heal this? And we said, leave it alone. Let it heal itself. And this is what happened. Okay? So here's what happened. By that disruption, even though it was unplanned, he found several more plant species that came up from the latent seed mite that weren't there before, after the disruption, and he had almost 4 times the forage biomass production out of those same acres after that disruption. So that was 120 days. Right. Okay, so flexibility is key. All right, so don't do things the same way every time. It's not a system. So how can you be flexible? And I'll talk more about this tomorrow. But alter stock densities. Don't move through your rotations in the same pattern. Alter rest periods. Alter species order if you do multi-species. Alter the time and season of the year that you're moving through different paddocks, different areas of your farms or ranches. Okay? Alter everything. Nothing is sacred, and nothing should be sacred in that regard. Constantly, and I do skip a paddocks and that kind of thing. I'll purposefully give some paddocks double rest from time to time and all of that. So, I want to leave you with this today. Just remember that sometimes there are good ideas and there are bad ideas. And this is a very bad idea. And by the way, this fellow is now singing soprano in the church choir, but so thank y'all very much. I appreciate it, and I've enjoyed it.